Good evening, America. I'm James Taylor and welcome to News Drops TV, a humorous, slight conservative twist when needed, as an add to the news mixology. I've seen fire and rain, all part of today's headlines.
And I'm Carly Simon. Tonight we bring you the latest developments from Washington and beyond. I am in anticipation. Let's get into today's news.
Our top story tonight, while Democrats are having a meltdown over one DOGE employee getting IRS access, they seem to have conveniently forgotten about the 919 people who had access under Biden.
That's right, James. The Trump administration's Department of Government Efficiency is planning to give software engineer Gavin Kliger access to IRS data for 120 days, and suddenly everyone's acting like it's the end of democracy as we know it.
You know, Carly, it's fascinating how selective some memories can be. Under the previous administration, we had nearly 1,000 people, including, get this, researchers and student volunteers accessing sensitive data.
Student volunteers? Well, I certainly feel safer knowing our tax information was being handled by college interns. But seriously, Treasury Secretary Bessent has assured Americans there's nothing to worry about.
The real story here seems to be about efficiency versus bureaucracy. DOGE's mission is to streamline government operations, and some people just can't handle that change.
Yeah, because it's better to just let those good folks at the IRS be weapon-equipped and ready for war, as was with the Biden direction. What would that be for? A knock on your door and there's an IRS agent pointing a gun at you, making sure you pay your fair share? Well, that's some kind of government limitations, eh?
Yeah, and right behind them is the FBI ready to take you in for speaking out at your Board of Education meeting. See you later, Biden. Speaking of change, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is considering a major shakeup at the Pentagon, potentially removing generals and senior officers who've been more focused on social experiments than military readiness.
A list is circulating on Capitol Hill containing names of officers who could be removed, particularly those involved in what Hegseth calls DEI woke stuff.
You know, there's something refreshing about a defense secretary who wants the military focused on, defending the country.
Though interestingly, Hegseth seems to have softened his stance toward General C.Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Their recent meeting showed signs of potential cooperation.
This will be good because sending pregnant men for training and for battle was seeming to hurt the image of the military. In what some might call a refreshing dose of common sense, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is pushing back against the Democratic panic over DOGE's access to federal data.
In response, protests have taken place across the country. Democrats such as Jimmy Gomez, Democrat rep from California, claims the data access risks national security, and that Musk is opening the door for criminals to get involved.
With all that DOGE is turning over, seems there's already plenty of criminal involvement. Good virtue signaling, Jimmy.
Bessent went on to say, here at Treasury, 2 people. They had read-only access to the systems, and they've remodeled the system. They have no ability to touch anything. They have no ability to make any changes. There are very strict guardrails around them. At the IRS, 1 person out of 90,000 employees is looking at this outdated IT system. That's all they're doing. And this kind of fear-mongering doesn't help anybody, he expanded. But it tells me that people are worried that they're part of the waste, fraud, and abuse.
Other Democrats, Senator Elizabeth Millionaire Princess Warrior Warren, Jasmine Street Urchin Crockett, and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Accountability is for Sissies Schumer have criticized Musk and DOGE, claiming so much is at risk, such as lobbyist funds that are given out and come back as lavish payments for helping out. They further iterated the concern about how are politicians expected to live on their meager salaries when all they want to do is serve the American public and just make a few extra bucks, kind of like a side hustle.
And speaking of waste and fraud, in a fascinating interview with Sean Hannity, Elon Musk and President Trump estimated DOGE has only uncovered about 1% of alleged federal spending fraud so far.
This is like a scene at an urban collapsed building. You lift a wall and all the rats scurry, lift another wall and there's more and on and on. And the people in charge, well, they ran out of rat traps, so they just decided to live with it. But the neighbors all suffered. Moving to our next story, While job losses are never easy, some economists are suggesting the current federal layoffs might help prevent what they're calling a debt death spiral.
The numbers are sobering, James. Our government ran a deficit of $1.8 trillion in the last fiscal year alone.
That's trillion with a T, Carly. And it stands for trouble, as they say. Our national debt now exceeds $36 trillion.
Let's put this in perspective for our viewers. Last year's deficit alone added 5% to the total debt America has accumulated in its entire 248-year history.
And here's an interesting comparison. The average federal employee makes about $106,382 annually, compared to the typical American worker's $66,621.
Not to mention those generous benefits packages and what Fed Week called that unspoken benefit. Job security that made it very difficult to get fired as a federal employee.
Well, it seems that particular benefit might be experiencing some adjustments.
Speaking of adjustments, major corporations are increasingly distancing themselves from DEI initiatives, marking what some are calling the death of DEI.
That's right, Carly. Companies from Walmart to Google are scaling back these programs, particularly in light of the Trump administration's recent executive orders.
The list is quite impressive, James. We're seeing companies like Target, Meta, Amazon, and even traditional institutions like the Smithsonian making significant changes to their DEI approaches.
What's particularly interesting is how many are shifting to what they're calling evidence-based, merit-driven processes.
Imagine that, hiring people based on their actual qualifications, as opposed to pronoun identities or how offended you can be over anything.
Here's something that might interest every American taxpayer. President Trump is considering what's being called the DOGE dividend.
This fascinating proposal would direct 20% of DOGE's savings back to American taxpayers, with another 20% going toward paying down our national debt.
We're talking about potential $5,000 refund checks to approximately 79 million U.S. households, Carly.
Though it's worth noting there's some debate about the exact savings figures. While DOGE's website claims $55 billion in savings, President Trump suggested today the numbers are in the hundreds of billions.
Either way, I think most Americans wouldn't mind getting their share of government efficiency savings.
Yes, and Democrats are busy generating the bill that will assure those checks, if delivered, will be taxed accordingly.
In a move that's sure to send shockwaves through the federal bureaucracy, President Trump has signed an executive order requiring agencies to evaluate regulations that might violate the Constitution.
This is quite significant, James. The Office of Management and Budget and DOGE will be spearheading this effort, with agencies having 60 days to submit their lists.
You know, Carly, this comes on the heels of several Supreme Court decisions limiting federal agency overreach, including that fascinating case about the Sacketts and their property in Idaho.
Ah yes, where the EPA tried to tell a family they couldn't build on their own land because of a nearby ditch. A ditch that fed into a creek that fed into a lake.
Sounds like exactly the kind of regulatory overreach this order is targeting. Speaking of federal agencies, we're getting a clearer picture of where those government workforce reductions are taking place.
The numbers are substantial. More than 200,000 federal workers at more than a dozen agencies have had their roles eliminated.
Let's break this down by department, Carly. The Department of Education, which President Trump has called a con job, has seen dozens of probationary employees let go.
The Department of Homeland Security lost over 400 employees, the Department of Energy about 2,000, and USAID has placed more than 10,000 staffers on leave.
You know what's interesting here? Many of these cuts seem focused on areas where there's been significant overlap or questionable effectiveness.
And let's not forget the IRS, which is seeing about 6 to 7% of its workforce affected. That's around 6,000 employees.
Oh, I think they could cut much deeper there and make up the tax deficit by all the dollars that won't be spent on things like Iran Sesame Street or promoting transgenderism for kids in Uzbekistan. How did we ever get here? Our next story takes us to international affairs, where President Trump's new approach to the Ukraine conflict is causing quite a stir in European capitals. Trump is in discussion with Moscow and letting Zelensky know that this war is his fault.
European leaders are reportedly stunned by the swift reversal of American policy, particularly regarding direct negotiations with Russia. Seems there's a change from the Biden-Zelensky playtime with American tax dollars. By the way, Zelensky has no account or traceability as to how the money was spent.
What's a little lack of financial accountability among world leaders and certainly politicians? What's particularly interesting here is how this highlights Europe's long-standing dependency on U.S. leadership, isn't it?
Indeed, French President Macron is scrambling to host emergency talks, while Ukraine's President Zelensky seems increasingly isolated, probably looking for those lost accounting receipts of around 500 billion American tax dollars.
There's some money well spent, eh? Perhaps this is the wake-up call Europe needed about taking responsibility for its own neighborhood.
We're seeing a remarkable trend here, James. Companies are not just modifying their programs. Many are completely restructuring their approach to hiring and development.
The list keeps growing. Pepsi, Google, Disney, GM, Intel, PayPal, Chipotle, Comcast, even JP Morgan Chase and Morgan Stanley are making significant changes.
It's interesting how quickly this shift is happening. Remember when these programs were considered essential just a few years ago?
Yeah, essential until planes crash, earnings trend down, and comfort spaces with fluffy, huggy stuffed animals take up too much space. Again, how did we get here?
The issue centers around the continued suspension of foreign aid programs, despite a court order to keep USAID functioning.
You know, Carly, it's interesting how quickly some people run to the courts when their funding is threatened.
Especially considering these programs are undergoing what the administration calls necessary review and audit.
Seems the courts aren't much into constitutional direction and would prefer to make statutes as we go along. Either their egos are tipping the scales of justice or their recollection of Soros' funds that helped position them where they are.
In a significant development from Capitol Hill, Kash Patel has been confirmed as the new FBI director.
Despite some controversy over his past statements and activities, Patel secured confirmation in what some are calling a new direction for the Bureau.
It's worth noting his strong stance on reforming the agency and his commitment to addressing what he calls institutional problems.
Though critics have raised concerns about his close ties to the administration, supporters argue that's exactly what's needed for real reform.
And the invasion of Mark Houck, the Catholic dad that was praying outside of an abortion clinic. Christopher Wray's invasion of Mar-a-Lago. Let's see, James Comey and Hillary Clinton's emails and computer smashing.
Or Kash Patel, who has challenged the standing FBI authority as overbearing and intrusive, while stating it needs to be catching criminals not sitting in offices dreaming up how to attack political figures.
Turning to border security, DHS Secretary Kristi Noem dropped some shocking numbers about criminal migrants today.
According to Secretary Noem, hundreds of thousands of criminals were allowed into the country during the previous administration, including gang members and cartel associates.
The administration is now pushing for mass deportation, with a particular focus on those with criminal records.
And let's not forget, this comes after President Trump's executive order designating cartels as foreign terrorist organizations.
That should concern Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, because that could impact a very large portion of the Mexican government officials.
This is big, because if Trump wants to go after cartels, Mexico will either have to protect them, or come to some agreement with the U.S. on how to handle them.
Yeah, those poor cartels. They need protection from the Mexican government.
And finally tonight, a seismic shift in Senate leadership as Mitch McConnell announces he won't seek re-election.
After decades in the Senate, including significant achievements like reshaping the Supreme Court and how to overstay your time in position, McConnell's departure marks the end of an era.
Senator John Thune has been chosen to replace him as leader of the new Senate majority.
Interestingly, at the CPAC conference near Washington today, news of McConnell's resignation was met with cheers.
Perhaps a fitting symbol of the changing of the guard in Republican politics, or that incoherency is no longer celebrated as a mark of a good leader? And that brings us to the end of our coverage for tonight.
Thank you for staying with us through these remarkable developments. From all of us here at News Drops TV, good night, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you for joining us. I'm Carly Simon, and nobody does it better, James, because you're so vain.
And I'm James Taylor. Right now, Carly, in my mind, I'm going to Carolina with Smackwater Jack. Good night, America. That's it for now. Be thankful and enjoy what you have. It's more than you think. If you liked our content, please give us a like and hit subscribe for more views through the News Drop scope.